Welcome back to Mark Fisher Outdoors, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to another episode. And today we're going to get into the weeds, and I mean into the weeds. We're going to be talking about the three-dimensional environment that bass live in. We live in a three-dimensional environment out here, but I think that it's difficult for anglers to think of the fish's environment as a three-dimensional environment. Unless you're a scuba diver, you don't have a lot of first-hand viewing of the environment that fish live in. And all of the tools that we use to look at the environment that the fish live in, whether it be topographical maps or our graphs, even forward-facing sonar, even though they portray a three-dimensional environment, they give it to us in that two-dimensional view. I'm going to ask you 4 questions just to get you thinking about this, kind of give you a little quiz. Just keep track of your answers. It's very quick. And just to get you thinking about this before we get into the details. Keep track of your answers. I'm willing to bet that you might get at least one of these questions wrong. Here's the first one. What is the most prevalent or largest edge in any lake? The second question, does an edge typically create a hiding spot for bass to ambush prey or a wall to contain prey from escaping from a bass? Or does it do both? The third question, are transitions between different weed types considered edges? And finally, when we think of edges as it relates to fishing, should we be thinking about vertical edges or horizontal edges, or both? Guys, think about the answers to those questions, and we'll talk more about the three-dimensional world that the bass live in when we come back. Welcome back to Mark Fisher Outdoors, everybody. I'm Mark Fisher. So it's the three-dimensional world that the bass live in and the edges that create that three-dimensional living space that the bass live in. Let's get into this subject by talking about the answers to those questions that I gave in the beginning. The most prevalent edge on any lake is, did you say the shoreline? It's not. It's not the shoreline, it's not the weed line, but it's actually the surface of the water. And a close second would be the floor, the bottom of the lake. That is the most prevalent edge on any lake, which leads to the question that we talked about, I think the last question, which was, should we be thinking vertical or should we be thinking horizontal? Well, the answer to that last question was, we need to be thinking both, because in a three-dimensional view or in a three-dimensional habitat, you have to be thinking about top, bottom, sides, and any contours within. And so those are part of the equation here. And we'll show you how that figures in as we keep going. I think the middle 2 questions were probably pretty easy for you to answer. Do weed edges or do edges provide a ambush point for the bass, or do they provide a wall or containment for prey for bass to ambush the prey against? And the answer is both. You got a rock wall, a rock jetty, the surface of the water. Shad are flickering up on top because they're trying to get away and they can't get any farther than the surface. Bass come up and feed on those shad over against the surface. That's 100% where the wall is creating a boundary for the prey. A weed line, bass stay in the weeds, fish comes by, Bass starts out of the weeds to ambush prey, a hiding spot. Pretty obvious. And different types of grasses. Different types of grasses grow in based on different types of bottoms. And so, yes, anytime you have a transition from one weed to another, that's considered an edge. It might be considered an edge because it also has a different bottom contour. It might be different because a fish can hide in one type of weed and ambush prey in another, but absolutely a different type of edge. But guys, how do we use this information? We use this information because these edges are such a critical part to a bass's functioning within their environment. Whether they're following edges from deep water in the winter to shallow water spawning areas, whether they're staying along shade line edges when the sun is up to ambush prey that are swimming past, whether they're in weed lines, whether they are on a contour break going from shallow water to deep water. We've talked about this in other episodes. You've got a contour break from shallow water to deep water. You have a piece of vertical structure like a dock post. That is the place where the bass is going to stay because they have more three-dimensional areas around them to hang close to be able to ambush prey, and they only have to pay attention to a limited number of areas. All of these things are important in maximizing your fishing. Let's talk about baits for a minute. If you're going to fish the top of a weed flat, chatterbaits or square bills can fish the top of a weed flat. Texas rigged worms can fish a little bit deeper on a weed flat. You've got a weed flat that's all the way up to the surface. Now you can fish frogs, or if the weeds don't come all the way to the surface, but you're going to fish the top surface, top water baits, buzz baits, things like that are relating to that surface of the water that is an edge as well. Basically, anytime we fish, what we are doing is looking for an edge within that three-dimensional environment that the fish are living in. And the more we can kind of conceptualize the fact that that's what we do as fishermen is attempt to find those edges, because we know that those edges play a huge role in bass feeding and living and spawning and traveling, that becomes the place that we want to target. So thinking in 3D is a hugely important factor in our being successful anglers. Guys, I know that this was a little intellectual, but I hope that this was a worthwhile topic to talk about. I'm very interested in your comments and your thoughts on this. I'd also be interested to know how you did on that little 4-question little quiz there. So please let me know about that. Guys, if you haven't hit the subscribe button, and we'll be back for another episode of Mark Fisher Outdoors tomorrow. Take care, everybody.